Good morning, class, and welcome back. We are going to read chapter 12 of Vught in the Hiding Place today. I hope you had a rich time of reading in that section for today. One announcement before we dive in. I've been checking out the analytics of YouTube. So YouTube gives you lots of statistics on how your videos are doing, which I could really care less about, except in this case, it actually shows me, um, well, the people that are viewing my YouTube videos, which is you guys, are watching 25% of it on average, which is really discouraging because I hope you know that. Both I and Mr. H and all your other teachers that make recordings for you in this new strange way of life that we find ourselves in, we do these intentionally expecting that you'll watch the entire thing. Because this is school, and again, school is required, and it's for your own good. And I think that it would be to your best interest to watch the full lesson. Um, is there a way that I can for sure track whether you've done that? That would be pretty difficult. But I'm asking you and telling you, if you're not doing this, to step it up and to have some integrity. What does integrity mean again? Integrity means you're the same person when the door is closed, right? When nobody's looking, when you're not held accountable, you can still act in the same character. That's what we're striving towards. So a big thank you to those 30% of the viewers that are actually watching the lesson because you are doing your job. And let me just tell you, I'll hop off my soapbox soon. It will not help you in the long run to do things with half effort. It will make your life really boring. But when you are actively engaged in what's going on in your learning process, then you will actually enjoy learning, believe it or not. When you'll force yourself to engage in something that doesn't seem that interesting, then you will reap the rewards of that effort. And you'll start to both enjoy it and get more out of it. Now, let's dive into the text. There are four things that I want to discuss from this chapter, and I'm going to pull a few quotations from the book. So one step in that active participation of the video is getting a book out, because I'm going to have quotes for each of these. The first page I want you to turn to is page 186. So please turn there with me. Sorry, it's taking a minute. 186. We are transitioning in this chapter from where they were in the prison that was run by people from the Netherlands, right? Dutch people, and now they are shoved onto a train very suddenly, and they are thinking and praying, not Germany, not Germany, because they've heard the horror stories about what happens to prisoners in World War II, even though they're in World War II. This has been going on for a long time, so they've already heard stories of what comes next, basically. But to their surprise, they did not leave Holland officially as far as where they are on the map. Now, they did leave the Dutch kind of way of life because now they're entering into a German camp. It's run by Germans, even though it's in Holland still. But there's a whole different atmosphere now because Germans are in charge and they have a new way of running things because they don't abide by the Dutch conventions about how you are supposed to treat prisoners because they don't really care. I use Netherlands, Dutch, Holland all interchangeably because they're different ways of referring to that region. Netherlands being the nation, Holland being the region, and Dutch being the people group and the language that they speak. So this is a time of transition. They're very worried. However, one bright spot from this initial transition is that Corrie is able to work her way through the crowds to find Betsy, and they are reunited. She notes specifically that they hadn't been separated for 53 years. They had grown up together and were inseparable. They lived in the same house forever. And now, in this prison time, Betsy and her were taken apart. but this new transition where all the prisoners are jammed together allows her to at least reach out and find Betsy, locate her, and the two sisters are reunited in this really dark place that they don't want to be. Um, what do we know about this camp? Well, there's a whole lot of registration stuff. The really boring details. We talked last time about how when they're initially removed from their homes, there's a whole bunch of registration as well. And we said it was clinical in the sense of there's a lot of paperwork involved, which is really odd. When you think of evil masterminds and you think of horrible systems of oppression, you might not think of paperwork, but that's actually really essential to how the Germans do things. They are extremely efficient, they're extremely orderly, even though they are extremely evil. And when you mix all these three things together, that's kind of the experience that these women are going through. So they have to do all of meaningless, this meaningless procession to get from one place to the next. They also think that they are going to be released. They see their possessions that were actually given back to them for a second, and then the people in charge say, "I'm sorry, there's been a mix-up. You're going to have to go back," and they get rudely thrust back into this camp, even into a sort of ceremony where they're welcoming the newcomers. And by welcoming, I don't mean anything comfortable. I mean they're striking the fear into them by showing them examples of horrible, horrible punishments. Let's turn to, we're going to have to read one of these. I'm sorry. 187. Prisoners, halt, barked the red-faced officer. Explain to the newcomers, Fraulein, the function of the bunkers. The bunkers, the girl began in a bored voice of a museum guide, are for the accommodation of those who fail to cooperate with the camp rules. The rooms are cozy, if a bit small, about the size of a gym locker. To hasten the educational process, the hands are tied above the head. She's speaking in really dry, sarcastic words. The educational process, right? As if they were trying to edify and educate the people to learn their rules. They're trying to punish them with cruelty, and that is. And then when they witness this cruelty, they won't break the rules because they are fear. They're living in fear. What do they see? They see a man crammed into a small bunker, which is really the size of a gym locker. We talk about this in movies, right? When there's a bully and they slam a kid into the locker and they kind of trap him in there, and it's kind of funny for a minute, and then there's end of the scene, and that's the end of it. And it's kind of fictional, right? It doesn't really happen. But this was part of what they actually did. They would take a person, they would tie their hands up, so they were in this position, and they would shove them into this crammed space to live for hours and hours. You can imagine what that would just physically do to your body. And when Corrie confronts this evil, she has to make a decision, right? She has to decide what a lot of people would decide. Now that I've seen this horrific evil, there must not be any God. Because if there was a God and he had the power to change us, he would not allow this to go on when he could see how horrible people can be to other people. And then there's the other option, which less people consider, and that is Corrie's decision, which is, God, help me to not even make sense of this, but help me to cope with this. I can't understand this. It's incomprehensible how people can do this to Corrie. And so Corrie says, because I can't understand this fully, because there's something there that doesn't sit well with me, I'm going to ask you as my heavenly Father to take this weight from me. Um, so she doesn't solve the problem of evil in the world. Instead, she asks God to take that weight from her because she doesn't have the ability to solve everything. So she compares it to the picture of her father, strangely enough, when she's asking about sex early in the book. And she's a young girl. She can't know these things yet. So her father says, actually, I'm not going to tell you because some things are too heavy for you to carry at this age. I wouldn't hand you my heavy suitcase, right? Because you wouldn't be able to lift it, at least yet. So she returns to that image and she says, now I get it. There are things even in my adult life that I will never be able to understand, such as this torturous way of living, this evil way of going about business in a really orderly, efficient way. How can you do something so inhumane in such an efficient fashion? Um, that's something that she ultimately has to just say, God, I don't get it, but I'm still going to trust in you. And I'm going to trust that you're going to lead us through this and change people's hearts. Um, Sorry, that was a long tangent, but let's move on. In this new scenario, it's not all bad. Overall, it's bleak, right? They're at a work camp. You don't want to be at a work camp because you're forced to be there, and it's nobody's dream life. They're in a wartime, but in the midst of this camp, they have this man who's referred to as the foreman. His name is Mormon, Mormon the foreman, and the foreman is not exactly a guard. He's not there to just drill them and make their lives miserable. He's actually there to overlook the work that goes on at the camp. Um, and he's a very humane man, meaning that he has kindness within him, even though he's in a position of authority above them. And he actually has a bit of a resistance going on in his own camp. That is, when he is instructing Corrie to build these radios that are going into the fighter jets, uh, Corrie gets thrilled and says, "Hey, I'm a watchmaker, and this is my alley. Like, I know what's going on. I can actually do this work, and I can do it well." And the foreman says, "That's awesome, except don't do it well. Actually, do it slower and mess it up a little bit because let's remember what these are being used for. That is, fighter pilots, German fighter pilots." So he has his own resistance against the Germans, even though he's working for them at the camp. He is part of the underground, right? It's part of that underground community of people that are being used by, um, or they're being abused by the government, yet they still are showing this resistance toward it. Um, this is a type of situation similar to Corey's earlier questions about when it's ever okay to lie and when it's necessary to lie, when it's actually the right thing to do to lie, or to steal, even to steal the ration cards. Is it the right thing um, to mess up the radio that you were supposed to fix and then turn it in and say, "I did my job"? Um, is that okay if it's for an evil man to use? Um, Maybe so. Is that lying? Would Nolly say it's lying? Perhaps. Um, but perhaps you think that it's a necessary lie. Let's move on. Um, that was page 190. 190, you can turn there, and there was a quote there. He says to her, "Dear watch lady, can you not remember for whom you are working? These radios are for the fighter planes." And reaching across me, he would yank a wire from its housing or twist a tiny tube from an assembly. The third thing I wanted to talk about is community life. 193. She says this is in ways better than her last community where she was all alone. I mean, it's pretty hard to be worse than that. Being stuck in a prison with nothing to do all by yourself. You can't even make noise and cry. Yeah. Uh, so there's this is a step up. There's a bit of a community in this factory location that she's working in. When the foreman leaves intentionally, they can kind of talk to each other and ask for updates and rumors about what they think is going on in the real world, even though every piece of news is completely fake. Um, they can still kind of piece together bits of the truth. Um, through just little slips of the tongue, even. Like when one of the guards says, if our soldiers can have half rations, live off of half rations, then you can too. That actually tells them some truth that he didn't mean to tell them. He just slipped the fact that the soldiers are not doing well. The soldiers on the front lines of the German army don't have enough food. Um, and that means big, big things for how they're doing in the war. So these women that are in the factory, while they're not told outright what's happening in the world, they can kind of get a sense for how the Germans are doing and how the world war is going overall and how close they are to an end of this prison camp. So that's a part of community that is actually very much a benefit for the soul of Corrie. She's actually talking with people again. Now, she finds there's definitely a dark side to this. Let's look at page 193 for that dark side. But what I had not realized in solitary confinement was that to have companions meant to have their griefs as well. This is the bottom 2/3 of the page. Um, I'll just keep reading and then we'll talk about it. To have their griefs as well. We all suffered with the women whose men were in this camp. The discipline in the male section was much harsher than in the women's. Executions were frequent. That means killing. Almost every day, a salvo of shots would send the anguished whispers flying. How many this time? Who were they? So, that's the downside, or not. It's the price, the cost of community. The cost of community is that when you're suffering, you suffer together. Christ would say, mourn with those who mourn. That's what Christians do. You don't ignore the pain of the world. When a coronavirus hits your nation, you don't close the door. You don't you don't push away the people that have problems now in 2020. As Christians, we need to open up our food pantries. I'm just going to say it. We need to do these things. We need to help those who are out of work now. Maybe that means opening up, helping them find a job. I mean, that's not really something you guys can do. But there are ways that you can reach out to these people. Maybe it's one of your friend's parents and your friend just needs a little encouragement because this season is new for them. Um, that's part of the community is suffering with them. In this case, it was much worse, where the men's camp was just over there, right, just a little bit removed, and they could hear certain men being executed, put to death, and they couldn't go check if it was their husband or their brother or their father. All they hear is the gunshot, and then they're left to worry. Um, that's a terrifying thought. I'm sorry I put it in your head. Um, but at least we can live through their experience and try to understand what it would be like. The final part that I wanted to talk about is page 192. So we're going back a page. 192, which is the discussion of Jean Vogel, which is the traitor to the Bayeux, essentially. The man who came right before the raid and said, I need some money. Will you help me? This is urgent. What would you do in my place? And she says, okay, fine. She was kind of out of it in the moment. And now she finds that man had betrayed all of them, that he was responsible for the raid, and he was responsible for identifying her as the ringleader. All of their troubles, um, she's able to pin on this guy's name now, Jean Vogel. Let's turn to page one. Sorry, I just read it out loud. 192. She feels a rage, right? Here's the kind of the middle-ish of the page when she's talking to Betsy in the middle of the night. Betsy, I hissed one dark night when I knew my restless tossing must be keeping her awake. 3 of us now shared this single cot as the crowded camp daily received new arrivals. Betsy, don't you feel anything about Jean Vogel? Doesn't it bother you? Oh yes, Corrie, terribly. I've felt for him ever since I knew, and pray for him whenever his name comes into my head. How dreadfully he must be suffering. For a long time I lay silent in the huge shadowy barracks, restless with the sighs, snores, and stirrings of hundreds of women. Once again I had the feeling that this sister with whom I have spent all my life belonged somehow to another order of beings. Wasn't she telling me in her gentle way that I was as guilty as Jean Vogel? Didn't he and I stand together before an all-seeing God, convicted of the same sin of murder? For I had murdered him with my heart and with my tongue. Lord Jesus, I whispered into the lumpy ticking of the bed, I forgive Jean Vogel, as I pray that you will forgive me. I have done him great damage. Bless him now and his family. And then she's able to sleep. And that's the end of our reading. Why? What's going on in this passage? She is feeling what you would expect to be a righteous anger. If anybody was deserving the blame here, was deserving the anger, it's Jean Vogel, the person who is responsible for this. But Betsy says, yeah, I think about Jean, and I pray for him, because he must feel some immense regret. He must feel some deep pain, at least deep down in his heart. Does she have proof of this? Of course not. She's Betsy. She sees the best in everyone, and she sees them as Christ sees them. And she says, I hope that they're okay. And she wants what's best for them. And Corrie, when she hears Betsy, she says, who are you? What kind of person says that? She says, I've known you for all these years, right? We've lived together since we were children, all our lives. And yet there's something so foreign about what you're saying. And I don't even know what to do. And then she looks inward and she says, she quotes Christ, and she says, when you hold anger against someone, it's like you're committing murder to them in your heart. That's Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. And all of a sudden, she says, I'm like Jean Vogel. Jean Vogel murdered many people by betraying them. And Christ says that I am no different. And that's a hard pill to swallow, right? But of course, the opposite is true, that when you forgive those who are the hardest to forgive, then you will also be forgiven. When you can let go of the pain and turn to grace in how you deal with people, then we can also trust that the Lord is gracious to us. And that is one of the most cutting, because it's painful, but also the most warm truths of the gospel, is that there is always a stream of grace for us. And Christ gives us the grace. He treated us with love even when we were hurting him. In the same way, In the same way, Corrie, and especially Betsy, before Corrie, are able to love this traitor, um, this Judas figure, with their whole heart and forgive him with this miraculous, supernatural love that comes from Christ himself. That's where I'm going to leave you today. Your assignment is to read page 195 through page 210. I'll repeat that one more time. Page 195 through page 210. Thank you for watching to minute 25. I probably won't have them this long. I'm trying to keep them short. But regardless, it is your responsibility as a student to watch the entire thing. So thank you for doing that. All right. See you later.